Well, so in this video, we're going to talk about Leonard Caddy's play Jekyll and Hyde. I've been reading a lot of Jekyll and Hyde plays recently. This one, if I'm honest, reads slower than a lot of the others that I've been reading. So, there's that. That may just be my own subjective experience of it, so it's worth taking that for what it is. That being said, Caddy's play does some interesting things. This play is very focused on women, in a way that Stevenson's novel absolutely is not. But that's very common, actually, for Jekyll and Hyde plays. They tend to have a much bigger role for women than Stevenson's novel. It would be almost impossible to have a smaller role for women than Stevenson's novel, but women tend to be very, very central in these plays. But in Caddy's version, that's very much the case. A lot of the play seems to be driven by Charlotte, the maid, actually. She actually doesn't quite start out as a maid. She starts out as a sort of temporary replacement for the maid. She grew up in an orphanage, and apparently Jekyll, whenever they need help, Jekyll sort of sends out to the orphanage to help out a person in need, an orphan in need, whatever it is. So she comes in. Jekyll is talking with Dr. Lanyon, his friend, Celestine, I guess, Lanyon's niece, whom Jekyll becomes engaged to, and Mr. Utterson. And Jekyll is putting forward these very, really, in a way, progressive notions about social equality. And he's basing this in his scientific research. He argues that regardless of who the person is, generally speaking, their brain is the same. He makes the argument that the brain, on average, weighs roughly the same amount. It has the same chemical composition, the same number of synapses, whatever it is. And so, though he does say that women's brains on average are smaller than men's brains. This is set, I think, in 1851 in this version, so, we've got that Victorian sexism, which, of course, is dumb as hell. But the argument, essentially, that Jekyll makes is that everyone has the same intellectual potential. What determines their relative ability, the relative cognitive or intellectual ability, is not biological. It isn't something inherent about them. It is social. It is socialization, the context in which they are brought up, the types of information that they're taught, etc., etc. And Celestine tries to make a counter-argument to this by appealing to breeding. And she tries to present a contrast between herself and Charlotte, basically arguing that Celestine, because she is a result of generations of good breeding, is always going to have an intellectual advantage over Charlotte. And Charlotte actually makes this impassioned speech that should get her fired, and every other character other than Jekyll believes that she should be fired, but Jekyll is really impressed by this, and he believes it confirms his theory. So Charlotte says, "It's not my fault. Can't help it. Didn't want to go to no orphanage. Didn't ask to be a grayscape." That's the name of the orphanage. "Never had no help. Always had to do what I'm told. I try, but I always do it wrong. Not my fault. Don't blame me if my face ain't right. Didn't ask for it to be like this. Anyway, I never seen what my face was like till I came here to doctor's house. And don't blame me if I don't know anything, because I ain't never been taught anything. The only thing I've been told is what I do wrong. Why ain't it fair? I do what I'm told. I always do what I am told. I try to be a good girl, even if I was told more, I'd know more. If I'd been told as much as you have, I'd know as much as you do, and be as clever. Doctor said so. I heard him. He said I'm the same as you are. Oh, you are really. It's only. He said I was as good as you are. He said, as good as you are. And then she sort of trails off. Now, what strikes Jekyll about this is this last little bit, where she says, and if I'd been told as much as you have, I'd know as much as you do, and be as clever. Doctor said so. I heard him. So that's actually really kind of a great moment, and Jekyll, I think, is the one who reads this correctly. This young woman who has never really been taught anything beyond obeying orders, Jekyll presented an argument based on relatively advanced, at least for the Victorian era, biological principles, and she followed along with the argument that he was making. And so he takes that as confirmation of his theory. Now, it's not entirely clear in this version exactly what Jekyll is trying to do with his experiment. It has something to do with unlocking the potential of the brain or freeing a person from the social conventions that have shaped them, but it's somewhat less defined either than in Stevenson's novel or in many of the other Jekyll and Hyde plays that I've read. But there's much more focus in this version, it seems, on gender relations and social class relations. So that's an interesting element of it. This focus on gender, class, and social relations becomes more pronounced in the second portion of the play when Penny arrives. Penny is Jekyll's woman, I guess, is the most accurate term. Girlfriend, maybe, lover, perhaps. She's Jekyll's, or she's Hyde's woman. She's a poor woman, and basically she comes to Jekyll's house to tell Jekyll to stop interfering with Hyde. And she confronts Celestine, and there's a big debate between them about which of their approaches to love is the more real one. Celestine's love, which is they both sort of agree is much more a cerebral connection to Jekyll, or Penny's love, which is a much more sort of visceral and gut-based love for Hyde. And there's a lot of debate between them whenever they encounter one another, which they do a few times. Hyde tries to rape Charlotte. Jekyll is good friends with Charlotte. He shows her a lot of fatherly type affection, etc., etc. So there's all of these different elements of gender and social class interconnected here. But the other thing that I find striking about this version, and this is especially in contrast to Stevenson's novel, though again, this same kind of thing shows up in a few other play versions. At the end of Act 1, Scene 1, we see the first transformation from Jekyll to Hyde, but Charlotte sees it. Charlotte witnesses the transformation. So, whereas in Stevenson's novel, the secret of Jekyll and Hyde's double identity is kept basically almost until the moment that Hyde and Jekyll die. here, from the very beginning, from the first transformation, it's not really a secret. And actually, there's a scene where Charlotte tells Lanyon and Utterson, I think, and Poole, the butler, that she saw this. And they don't believe her, which, I mean, it makes sense because it's a crazy thing to say. But, like, it's clearly not a secret here in the way that it is in the novel. And so that's another really interesting difference. But the other thing that I think is really cool about this version, actually, is that it makes very overt the theatricality of the transformation from Jekyll to Hyde, and I think that works really well. I would argue that Stevenson's novel should have been a play in the first place, because the transition from Jekyll and to Hyde and back is it's visually striking. And so in this play, at least in the Samuel French version that I'm reading, there's a set of production notes that describes how the Jekyll and Hyde transformation should occur. And it talks about it in the different scenes of the play. So what it says here is, it's assumed that Jekyll's transformation into Hyde will be achieved by alteration of stance, movement, expression, and voice on the part of the actor, and by such changes as removing trim mustache from Jekyll, adding ugly projecting false teeth for Hyde, and a change from neat Jekyll hair to Hyde's unruly tangle by removing or adding a wig, or by the actor ruffling his own hair if this looks more effective. Some overdressing by Jekyll, such as a false cravat and stiff collar on a spring neckboard to cover Hyde's untidy and dirty neckwear, should be employed. The changes should become progressively more marked, the later ones being abetted by adding makeup and dirty, ragged clothing. The actor could use a mask if this is felt to be more effective. The techniques employed in effecting the transformation are envisaged as follows. Scene 1. The makeup, wig, teeth, etc. required for the transformation should be set ready for Jekyll behind the armchair, so that when he slumps behind it, he can quickly effect the change to Hyde. Scene 2. The transformation can be made off stage. Scene 3. Jekyll changes into Hyde while crouching behind the table, concealed by the chenille tablecloth, under which the makeup has been set. Scene 4. The transformation can be made off stage. Scene 5. The makeup should be set by the armchair in the laboratory so that Jekyll can effect the transformation concealed by the armchair while the laboratory is in darkness. So, most play versions of Jekyll and Hyde, at least that I'm familiar with, have the same actor playing Jekyll and Hyde. It makes the most sense, realistically. Caddy's version is unusual in how much direction it gives about what this transformation should visibly look like on stage.